On behalf of the Wilmette Institute, I am happy to welcome you to this session on Unconventional Conversations on Race, presented on the occasion of the Grand Canyon Conference. I had the pleasure of participating on the online sessions offered by Counselor Nwandi Lawson and Ms. Judith Mcrae a few weeks ago. And I'm very excited for more people to learn about this essential approach to conversations on race. Nwandi Lawson is a member of the Continental Board of Counselors for the Americas. She has several decades of experience hosting, writing, and producing for commercial and public broadcasters, including CNN, TBS, and many others, as well as for corporate and non-profit clients through her production and media consulting companies, Rêve Production and the Virtues Collective. A native of the San Francisco Bay Area, Nwandi earned an MBA from Emory University and an undergraduate degree in journalism from Howard University. She was elected to serve 2 terms on the Board of Governors for the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences and has served as the Southeast Regional Emmy Awards judging chair. Business and Professional Woman named her Georgia Woman of Achievement, and she received a Southern Regional Emmy for production of the Georgia Musical Hall of Fame Awards. Her current productions and media consulting work highlight the ways that diversity, equity, and inclusion can be achieved towards racial unity. We know that some of us are familiar with dear Counselor Lawson's background. She became a Baha'i in 1999 in West Africa, Cameroon, and served, as a children's class teacher, area teaching committee member, and local spiritual assemblies, auxiliary board member, and now our dear counselor. So we welcome you. Thank you so much for being here. With your dear colleague, Judith McCray, has taught us several institutions of higher education and is a Chicago-based media producer and multiple Emmy Award-winning journalist with 30 years of experience in broadcasting production and programming. She has developed and produced award-winning programming examining issues of social justice and racial inequalities, civil and human rights, science and the environment, history, and education. Her documentary films, public affairs programs, and educational and advocacy videos and podcasts have served as vehicles for the voices and experiences of those unrepresented in mainstream media coverage. Additionally, she is a producer for the U.S. Baha'i Media Services for A Rich Tapestry, which I love, a video storytelling series that expresses and illustrates how love is being translated into action to address questions of race and culture in the U.S. I invite Ms. Lawson and Ms. Mcrae to introduce the other wonderful panelists, and thank you all so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, teacher. Really appreciate it as well. Thank you for those very kind words. I want to ask our panelists, because you all are our participants. You helped us to learn about these conversations, the unconventional conversations about race. So maybe you could just begin, and maybe we'll start with Mary and Dennis Mcgregor. If you could just give us names and the area that you live in, and then what attracts you to an unconventional conversation about race?
I'll go ahead and start. My name is Emmy Mcgregor. I live in Benbrook, Texas, which is right outside of Fort Worth. And I have been a part of this journey with Bahá'i Law since 1983. I learned about the faith in Ohio, in the inner city, in the Glenville area, through a friend of mine who had been a Baha'i for over 50 years. And so she shared it with me, and I went to classes and just felt in my heart that this made sense. This is how I had felt all of my life, but didn't understand where those feelings were coming from, that people were put here on the earth to live together, to work together, to make the planet a better place. So I'm just walking this journey and wanting to stay in the room, even when things are uncomfortable, stay in the ring, as my friend Barbara Talley always says, and just keep fighting with a humble posture of learning to help me grow as a person and work with others to build the kingdom of God on earth. That's why I'm here.
Praise God. You have a very nice gentleman sitting there next to you. Maybe he can introduce himself too.
I'm the other Mcgregor, Dennis, member of Texas, just outside of Fort Worth. Also became a Baha'i the same year as Mary. We didn't know each other. It was a different part of the country. She was in Ohio. I was here in Texas. Actually, I was in Denton, Texas. That's where I became declared. But I'm still trying to be a Baha'i. Let me put it that way. It's one thing to identify it, but to truly live it, to live the life, it's another story. It's a journey that will continue. But I just, as far as what drew me to Unconventional Conversations, it's interesting because some recent stuff I've gotten involved in, it's when I think of unconventional, oftentimes I'm familiar with the aspect of conflict and contention that happens in this issue. How do we learn to be truthful and kind at the same time? Be truthful and kind in its journey. But also not so much how do I model it myself? Because I'm going to have my own journey forever in this life and the next. But it's just something that we strive to learn and just listen and learn. It's just exciting to just never too late to learn. Just can't you can't get too old to learn. That's what I love.
Isn't that a blessing?
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. Maybe we can go to Alaska next and invite our friend Lori to introduce herself. Oops, let's get you unmuted there. Let me see if I can help. Because we definitely want to hear what you have to say. Yes, there we are.
Okay, so hello, everybody, all my relatives out there across the country and the world. I am born Ladana. I'm citizen of the Tlingit and Haida Indian tribes of Alaska. My tribe is one of 224 in the state of Alaska. And I think my Indigenous relatives would like to extend a greeting to each and every one of you who are listening to us today. We are all 99.8% genetically the same. I've learned that through going to some racism or eliminating racism workshops. They're very important that we become educated and learn about the world that we have inherited today. Both of us, the Indigenous and non-Indigenous, are living and working to manage, to reorganize our world today and our spiritual lives. On behalf of my children, your children, our grandchildren, I think it's important that these kind of conversations are heart-centered. Sometimes we're too scholarly, I think, and sometimes we are maybe more focused on the word and our circles of study and our own personal growth and development to a point where we don't step outside our bubble And remember that in an indigenous world, we represent everybody. We represent the grassroots. We represent those who are not speaking today. And so it's not about me. It's about the people that have made me who I am. We always acknowledge our clan relatives. I'm Raven Duck Dane Ton. That means I'm not acknowledging myself, but I'm acknowledging my relatives and those who hold me up. So I like the heart-centered, the informality of unconventional conversations. It's like having meaningful conversation, heart to heart, with somebody with no agenda in mind, but to develop long-lasting relationships and and coming to a point where we truly believe we are all related and connected. Guna Chish.
Thank you, Laurie. We'll go last to Lev. Certainly last but not least in any way.
My name is Lev Rickards. Thank you, Councillor Lawson. I live in the suburbs southeast of Oakland, California. And what attracts me to the idea of an unconventional conversation on race is perhaps a dissatisfaction with current conversations about race and a desire to explore a conversation that is rooted in local action and guided by messages from Baha'i institutions.
That's very helpful. Well, we're going to go through then and take a look at what makes these conversations unconventional. And we're going to, this time around, we'll go behind the scenes a little bit and look at what made these conventions what made these conversations unconventional, and how can they perhaps be replicated? As Lev just pointed out, they're connected to local action, so they don't take place at the global level, even though they may start there. They eventually have to get down to the grassroots.
And as you all know or remember, I mean, each of the sessions, the 4 sessions, we opened up with it's just kind of a restatement of what Baha'is believe. And we, different times we read through them, other times we just kind of read them to ourselves. But I'm curious for each of you in terms of people watching this and seeing how to go forward. I'm a friend of the Baha'i, but I'm not a Baha'i. I've certainly been attracted to the Baha'i religion since I first went to college at Northwestern and became aware of the Baha'i temple in Wilmette. But it's really been since working with Nwandi and others on the production team when working on A Rich Tapestry that I've just been totally delighted and admiring that there is this path that's kind of laid out for individual and collective work, but to work collectively on how do we truly walk to know God. But that really is about unity and really believing it, finding it, acting on it. So as a non-Baha'i, it's intriguing to me that there's so much emphasis put on following the guidances as kind of a roadmap without it being dogmatic. So I'm just curious with each of you as members of the Baha'i Faith, and some of you, like Mary and Dennis, been members for a long time. What were your observations as we began the conversations? And we always started out with these brief descriptions from the different guidances or letters.
I feel that the letters that come from our institutions, they feel like letters from God. God works through people, and their guidance to help us tread this path safely through obedience. So when the letters come and the guidance, we take it to heart. I take it really to heart and ask God for guidance. Ask Him to help me understand what is it that I am supposed to do in my community as an individual, in my family as Dennis's wife, in my work as a middle school special ed teacher with the other teachers that I work around, in my role in the institute process, in the book 1 with my aunt, who is not a Baha'i, but a friend of the faith, like you, Judith, and wanting to be involved in this. The letters are very important, and I take them to heart and try to understand how I can work together with others.
Okay. Anybody else in terms of what and starting with the guidances or letters?
So one of the things that attracted me to the faith, I was born a Baha'i in 1977 in Seattle, Washington. So that's my birth home. What I was attracted to was how it validated me as a Native American, how it gave me permission to be Native American, how it provided me with boundaries and honor. It told me that I could be my own true self. It gave me permission to stop drinking. The laws of the faith really attracted me. The elimination of prejudice and the equality of men and women, and also gambling, the laws of gambling and chastity. It was work as worship. I felt it was such a practical religion, and it fit so beautifully in the time of my life that I really needed. It was kind of like, something greater than myself, saying, you're okay, you're going to be okay, you make a difference, you're specially loved, and go for it. I became a Baha'i when I heard Dr. Mcgregor speak. I have a special place in my heart for Dr. Mcgregor because he told us in the Pacific Northwest, we must teach the natives, mustn't we? And just the way he said it was just so loving. It was so gentle. It was so strong. He was so grateful. He was so grateful to be in the Pacific Northwest, the home of so many Native Americans. And I really perked up my ears and my head, and I thought, oh my word, he's speaking to me. Mm-hmm. And truly he does speak to the faith does speak to every single tribal value I've ever known. So I love the values and the laws of the faith in particular.
So it sounds like that was helpful, to many of you, that we did return each week to what it is that Baha'is believe, and then also to the guidance. And I know, one of the behind the scenes pieces, if you will, is that Judith and I always reflected together immediately after each session, just for a few minutes, and we didn't prolong what was even good, maybe 15 minutes. But we would say, look at this, we weren't sure coming in. Will a mixture of people, some Baha'is, some who are friends of the faith, some who are veterans, some who are new, will they object if week after week we keep returning to these beliefs? Will they eventually say, we already know this, And we just remarked that they did not. And so we thought, well, it's helpful to refresh ourselves again and again on what it is that we believe. And then to return, as we mentioned, again and again to the guidance of the institutions of the faith. And in this case, we were so fortunate because in July, the Universal House of Justice wrote directly to the Baha'is in the United States and talked to us very specifically about race in America. Something that, of course, we were all turning our eyes towards because we'd had not only the pandemic, but an entire spring and summer of racial justice coming to the forefront, with police killings becoming very visible and the nation having perhaps more time to reflect on itself. And at that point, the House of Justice, of course, wrote to us. And in case we were confused and weren't aware as to whether racism was still something that Baha'is in the United States would have to work against, well, the House of Justice let us know that racism is a profound deviation from the standard of true morality. And then it went on to let us know, what its implications are. It deprives a portion of humanity of the opportunity to cultivate and express the full range of their capability and to live a meaningful and flourishing life while blighting the progress of the rest of humankind, letting us know that it is impacting every single person, not just one group or another. And then it went on to say it cannot be rooted out by contest and conflict. It must be supplanted by the establishment of just relationships among individuals, communities, and institutions of society that will uplift all and will not designate anyone as other. So these became very primary points in the way that we were approaching this particular conversation and wanting to make sure it was unconventional, that we wouldn't have an argument about whether or not racism was still relevant. That wouldn't be part of the conversation. We wouldn't need to have a conversation in which we had to decide which side was impacted by racism. We knew everybody is. And we really knew that we weren't going to have a conversation in which we thought about partisanship or sides waging against one another, because in fact, that would be a very futile exercise. So we needed to figure out how will everyone be uplifted and how will no one be designated as other. We knew we'd have to learn about this, though. It wouldn't be something that we would just be able to automatically turn on.
And so we then took that next step, and this is just kind of the genesis of how this came together, because there wasn't anything particular that Nwandi and I discussed or considered that is unique to us, other than creating kind of a framework for discussions to be held like this. So we kind of pivoted off of particularly the concept in the July 22nd guidance of racism as a profound deviation. And we thought if it was a profound deviation, we need a profoundly different way of going about this than what most of us have been in a number of conversations that have gone badly or didn't go far enough, but really was not necessarily about the hard work and the openness to how do we create relationships across all borders and boundaries. So as we began to think about how could we have these conversations, one of the guidances that has always been really impactful to me in the 3 years or so that I've been working with the team was this one: the evils of racism, materialism, and moral decadence will be eradicated only by a love that is translated into action, such actions as deliberately going out of our way to befriend all, appreciating the indispensable contributions of all, and joining hands with all in the creation of a new world. We believe in the fundamental goodness and decency of the masses of our fellow citizens. We are confident that Americans yearn, as we do, for spirituality, that they desire genuine justice and prosperity for everyone. And for me personally, one of the things that keeps attracting me to the Baha'i faith and what I love about being around Baha'is is there really is, as you were saying, Lori, this work as worship. I mean, we get our hands dirty and have to really, or as you said, Mary, stay in the room. And so as we talked about how do we stay in this room without becoming negative and doing all the things that we're striving to do, we thought, well, let's take apart each of these four. Love that is translated in action was the first one. Deliberately going out of our way to befriend all. Appreciating the indispensable contributions of all is the third. And then joining hands with all in the creation of a new world. And have a conversation on taking each of those steps, giving some examples because we happen to have access to them, but other people have access as well to several of the tapestry videos, to give an example of other individuals, Baha'is and non-Baha'is, working together to build community and to address racism and paternalism, and see what happens. See, how do we have these conversations with well-meaning people to figure out how do we look at this, go away for a week, try out the ideas, try out some actions, come back and say how you felt about it, what worked, what didn't work, what ideas you had, and then take on another step.
And since action was so much a part of this, we decided, because of course Judith and I are both media producers, and so we said, well, let's use video as just one means for showing an example. It doesn't mean that videos are, something that has to be in each of these discussions, but for this purpose, and particularly since we had to interact virtually, we thought it would be helpful. So you recall that in the first session, we described how love was translated into action, and we used the video from Minneapolis that was the response to the killing of George Floyd, and how those friends were responding in a way that was translating love into action. We looked at a Chicago couple that was told, "You are the face of gentrification," and looked into how we deliberately befriend all. They certainly could have had a different response if they were unaware of the Baha'i position on trying to let your heart burn with loving kindness for all who may cross your path, including those who appear to be insulting you at first glance. And so we got a chance to study and consult about that. We then looked in the third session into appreciating the indispensable contributions of all. all and how the Navajo community is serving in the face of paternalism. We'll look at that video together again today. And then joining hands with all. This was the one with the Mexican American youth helping to develop a family camp when they noticed that their African neighbors were not actually in the same conversation that they were in. Again, this awareness that we have the opportunities to do this at the level of our community. And then each time we would reflect on what actions we could take together.
And then before we would go into discussion or after the video, as everybody recalls, we would do just kind of this fun, what is your emotional response today? Each of the weeks we had a different question, what are your feelings about being here? What are your feelings about this being the last session? So just for fun, if you guys would take part in the poll right now of what is your emotional response today to engaging in conversations about race. And the reason we did this was to be, one, again, get a sense of everybody, where everybody was feeling, a way to kind of make people feel comfortable about being able to share, since we didn't know each other when we were from all over the country, but also to give us some conversation starters in terms of how we were all at that moment trying to decide of what is this unconventional conversation, and what's my role in participating.
Absolutely. We never want to overlook emotions. We know sometimes the conversation on race becomes kind of bogged down because it either becomes one that is wholly focused on how I am feeling at this moment, or it becomes completely devoid of any of my feelings. And people say, just keep going. It's an intellectual exercise. And we wanted to recognize that, no, we're human beings. So we actually do have feelings. And see, as you all are saying, we have a mixture here between enthusiasm and joy and hope and confidence when we think about our response to engaging in the conversation about race. So that was just an element that we always added.
And it was interesting as we went through the 4 weeks. I remember in Nwandi, the first week we had a number of people that did check anxious, scared, that they weren't sure what it was going to be. And we talked about it afterwards when people come back. But we seemed to actually build on everyone wanting to share and see where the next step was going to go. That by the time we were finishing, I think we had mostly hopeful and confident, enthusiastic and joyful. I think we just had a couple that were sad, melancholy about it ending.
That's right. It is quite amazing how human beings, often we get very attached to our emotions and or our personalities, and yet these things are entirely malleable. So they can change if we have the right environment. And that's one of the things that we could see in reflection on our actions together. So as we did before, we're going to take just 5 minutes now and watch this excerpt from the video that we referenced in terms of intentionally befriending all. And while we're watching it, it's one of the Rich Tapestry series. But I know, Judith, you had some good points that you helped in one of our first reflections as to how to help people watch a video so that we're not just voyeurs. But what were some of your thoughts on that?
Right. And this one's actually, we were working with the point, appreciating the indispensable contributions of all. And so because we were focusing on a Native American community, Navajo, 3 different women particularly telling the story about how they are defining for themselves their own identity and who they are and working against paternalism. We didn't want people to get caught in a trap of like, isn't that so wonderful? These wonderful people are doing this wonderful things indigenously without having to examine our own thoughts and efforts in terms of how do we address paternalism, even if it's not about something as nice and neat as this video shows it. So we were, that was part of our rallying cry as we started this video, was like not to limit ourselves to just admiring what these women are talking about, but what are our experiences that we could appreciate or engage in contributions of working towards unity and against paternalism in all areas.
All right, so let's take a look, and then we'll have a chance to actually do some of the type of discussion that we would do when we were in the sessions together.
The obstacles were, as this group of young people were arising and trying to find language and expression of their own thoughts and what we were experiencing with the core activities, that we ran into paternalism.
The Navajo have always been here in this land, in the area between the 4 sacred mountains, which encompasses the Four Corners region, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. This relationship between the Western world and Native communities has been a turbulent one, and many Indigenous people in the United States weighed down by this really terrible history of colonialism. Colonialism is the total subjugation and dominance of one nation over another, forcing upon that nation their beliefs and ideas and religious systems, social, economic systems. In the same sense, paternalism is the attitude that we know best for you, and regardless of your beliefs or your will for your own self or your own tribe. This is why Native Americans tune out immediately when you begin to tell them about another religion, because they're expecting that attitude of paternalism and that Western colonial attitude that they know what's best for you, and thereby they're not giving Native Americans a choice. The attitude has persisted, and bluntly, that attitude is racist. It's racism. It's embedded in our very American culture, and it permeates just about everything we do and think. And the Native communities have, in a sense, built walls against it.
How does an Indigenous community
Keep going. I'm going to take that as a cue that we have seen enough of that to help us with our discussion, and you all had a chance to watch it before. So maybe we can, as we have done in the past, give consideration to the conditions for consultation, because that was always a big part of how we conducted the unconventional conversation on race. And we remember that, of course, we're given these requisites for consultation. And when we use them, then some of these things that sometimes come across as conflict and contention, what is the impact when we think about devotion and dignity, when we think about, really looking to hear the viewpoints of everyone, as opposed to trying to dominate or manipulate people, which is really the content of the conversation that those young people were having. So based on that, we can think about, what examples that we can think of appreciating the indispensable contributions of all, but also challenges that we've seen. The young women referenced paternalism. Where have we seen challenges to appreciating the indispensable contributions of all? And then how would we be able to help one another or work during the week to try to carry out some of these actions so that we can get experience with appreciating the indispensable contributions of all?
Yeah, Dennis? Hope you guys are muted.
Here you go. Okay. It's amazing how reinforcing it is, all this stuff about trying to unlearn paternalism. Because it's like, for example, I think early in the day, was it Thursday or Wednesday morning? I think the person who helped facilitate it asked, okay, what things do you feel like you need to work on? And things like that too. And also, what do you want to be or beyond that? I can't remember Calvin. But anyway, I put down for myself, I put something getting rid of the poison of paternalism. So, and then it's just a confirmation. Later on in the conference, somebody else spoke and was sharing a story of Mr. Nwandi coming to Canada to meet with the Indigenous populations and speak with the group. And him walking up to somebody who was not a Baha'i at the time, but he walked to this individual, spoke in this person's ear, and said, "Help us." Didn't say, "What can we do to help you? We're here to help you." He didn't say that. He said, "Help us." And that's a totally different shift when we come in with this maybe well-meaning, okay, we're here to teach the oneness of mankind and y'all need this. Mm-hmm. That's pretty paternalistic if you go with that approach. But look at the power that's within the populations that are still thriving in spite of what's happened with colonialism. Mm-hmm. The indigenous populations and the people of the eye, the African American, the strengths that are inherent within these populations. We need that to help build that. And how do we define, if people know their nobility, you don't know, like the definition of people of the eye, it says, oh, we can say, well, you're like the pupil of the eye. That doesn't mean anything unless you break it down. It's, okay, you're reflecting the light that's in front of us and sharing it back, reflecting it back to us. So a lot of times if they reflect something back to us, sometimes the dominant group does not want to hear it. So we don't want to hear those reflections. So it's just kind of like, it's part of the humility that's got to continue. Mm-hmm. So
it's very helpful. I think, Lori, you wanted to add to the consultation as well, if I'm not mistaken. Oops, I'm going to see if we can unmute you again.
One of the things I notice most about Indigenous communities and gatherings that they're in a circle. You know, the Universal House of Justice consults on a circular table, and that way you're shoulder to shoulder, you're equal, and no one's behind you, no one's in front of you. And I think that's really important if you want to have an ambiance that includes devotion, courtesy, dignity, care, and moderation. You have to be, I need to be very cognizant of who's up front, who's leading from behind, who's speaking for all, who's not, and to make sure that the welcoming spirit that we can learn from the Indigenous communities is really incorporated. Greeting people at the door, acknowledging everyone that comes in, being trying to not be too cliquey. Sometimes we're more comfortable with others than we are reaching out to those we don't know so well. Everyone needs to feel embraced and welcome. So those are what matter to me in consultation. Is that the gathering is circular, we're in serried line, so to speak, and we're asking everybody, even if they're just there in body, that everybody's there in spirit.
That is so helpful, right? Sometimes the establishment of the environment is also in terms of, what are the placement of the people? How do young people and older people know that they are contributors? How do people of different educational attainment know that they're contributors? How do people know without these the veneer of class or race or some of the other things that make people separate? How do they know? And part of it is just that. I know sometimes I'll go into just even a gathering with the kind of work that I do, and I'll notice someone that will seat themselves kind of far from the action, but that's because of the perception that that guy, he's a floor director, he's not at the top rank. So you literally have to go and bring, no, actually we need to hear from you. So please come closer to the table, and then make the space, often so that because it's not common, I don't think, in society to think as Lori's saying, it's a circle. Everybody is in the circle, and we have to all be able to contribute.
There was a quote I heard one time about, it's not my right. It's not about my rights. It's about my obligation to community. It's not about me. It's about how everyone else is fitting in and feeling embraced.
Yeah.
Just building off of this image of being in a circle together, around the time that we started these unconventional conversations, our family started hosting a devotional gathering in our town called Pray, Walk, Talk for Racial Justice. We meet in the local park and get together and say some prayers, and then walk around the park and have a conversation about racism and about constructive action that we can take in our community. We were inspired by some friends in Kansas City doing something similar. And I think that when we started that, I had an expectation that we were going to have certain kinds of conversations or hear certain kinds of voices. And it didn't end up going that way. It turned out that there were more children participating, and mostly children from Baha'i families, than I expected. And that really changed the tone of the conversations that we were having. And the questions that the children brought often led the kinds of discussions that we had, instead of questions from adults kind of living together in our town. And perhaps that's a kind of paternalism that I hadn't thought about before. Nwandi mentioned age, and we can be paternalistic towards those sometimes who are older, unfortunately, and also those who are younger.
You know, one of the things that came to my mind when you mentioned paternalism, and that the women, all women, feel the effects of that. However, for Indigenous women, I think there's also a maternal paternalism, maternal, whatever it's called. White women have privilege, and sometimes they don't recognize that. And when they're comfortable with their status and who they are, and they're sometimes not sensitive either. I mean, all of us can learn, you know, how much we contribute to the inequities.
I was reflecting back, and I know, Judith, you may be thinking about this too, when we had this discussion initially and we were able to reflect on the video and how it is that we appreciate the indispensable contributions of all, we really got some rich examples, didn't we, that were, that were shared.
Well, and it was interesting to me, I mean, because I had taken notes at that time that I'll share with you guys. I mean, literally was Lori, shortly after you talked about we're all living on native land, that as a challenge, almost, you didn't take it as a challenge, but I've been certainly in other groups where people would have shut down at that point, right? But instead it became a much broader than what the video was even speaking to. I know we spoke about appropriation and tokenism and how do you find a balance to be open and aware and learn from others without taking from that culture. We had a big discussion on finding out which tribal lands you were born on or lived on, as well as talking about the difference between assimilation and integration. So we went into a lot of different areas on that particular conversation based off what could have been a contentious statement, but it seemed to be a space that everyone came in appreciating how we started, the guidances, as well as the conditions for consultation that was handled with quite a bit of love and understanding. And again, to use your word, Mary, your phrase, Mary, staying in the room. Do you guys want to share in terms of your memories from that time, or how you were able to literally stay in the room? And Lori, your comments, on down to your comments at the end about recognizing that we're all 99.8% the same, and how that's had to address how you look at yourself and identify as a Indigenous person.
I think for me, as a pupil of the eye, you have to live in a state of prayer. So a constant state of prayer. So when things happen that you don't anticipate will happen, and they will, sometimes it closes my mouth. And that's when I know, okay, I need to listen and give it to God. Let Baha'u'llah take over this space, because something's happening in the stomach. In the Native and the Black celebration that we just had, that Barbara put on, one of the Native friends talked about something happening in your stomach. I believe it was a Jacqueline left-hand bull when she did her presentation, that when things came up that were not very comfortable, something would happen in her stomach. And that happens to me, this rumbling, this nervousness. And when that happens, it's like a little voice says, okay, it's time to give it to Baha'u'llah. You don't have to carry this. He says, give it to me. You stay silent and you learn, and I'll give you the words that I want you to convey. And I have been in situations where I've had to do that. And when I do that, I feel so much better, so protected. When I don't listen to the voice, that's when I get the trepidation. So I'm learning when these things happen and when I get that in my stomach, okay, Baha'u'llah, Ya Baha'u'llah Pa.
I wonder what are some ways that we can draw people into the conversation. So I'm going to ask a difficult question. Many of us are like-minded here, and we're committed to building a unified world. How do we call people into conversations that may not have the same worldview that we have?
Well, my feeling about that is that you have to develop true and lasting relationships. You have to convince an Indigenous person or show in action and indeed that you care about them, you're interested in them, you need them in your circle, you want to hear from them. They are a valuable part of the human race. It's meaningful to you that they're a friend. And then gradually you can and offer them the gift of friendship, and that goes a long way into opening their heart to talk to them about other things. Racism is a really painful, hurtful, difficult thing that's happened in people of color. And one of the things that I think is important to maybe think about is if you are an English-speaking person, and if you've been an English-speaking person all your life, somebody comes along when you're 5 or 6 or 7 and tells you, no more English, no more English, you need to speak Arapaho. And I'm going to punish you if you don't. You're going to have to kneel on some marbles, or you're going to have to, we're going to also cut your hair. We don't want you to look English. You wear your hair like we want you to wear your hair. And you don't have a name either. Don't you dare use your English name. I'm going to call you number 77. Now, if you can empathize at least for a fraction of a moment of how traumatizing that might be, then you have the ability to empathize and to truly love and care for that person, because you can maybe see in your mind's eye or in your heart how difficult that experience has been. And there is such a thing as generational trauma. There's generational healing also, and that's what we're calling on. We're calling and promoting and encouraging the healing today that I'm seeing all over the Baha'i community. The acceptance and the ability to listen with respect, and the desire to hold each other up, even if you aren't looking like me. There's a realization that, we're all creative, we're all talented, we're all loved by God, and we need each other. Help me. Don't, like Dennis said, it's help us, help me. Don't let me help you. It's just such a critical start. You just can't go up to a person of color or Indigenous and say, would you co-facilitate a study circle with me? Because they're an important part of the study circle, but I'm going to go like, I don't know you, and I don't trust you, and I'm unsafe in that kind of an environment. What's your motive? Mm-hmm. Is it to make your study circle better and so that you look better, or is it, do you even have an idea, if you want to hear what I have, how I interpret, a quote or contribute in the study circle? I don't think you use tribal values, or you don't relate, what you're trying to give me or teach me with my worldview in mind. So that's a beginning. Just really, really nurture meaningful relationships and conversations. And don't wait for Thanksgiving. Please do it for no reason at all.
Yeah. Yes.
I'll tell you though, this Thanksgiving we did just hearing your voice at one of those sessions reignited my independent investigation of truth of now where we live exactly and who lived here, and teaching my children and everything that led up to Thanksgiving and the day itself. I want to thank you for that. It reignited my commitment to investigate the truth.
Just that little bit of information will probably be remembered for a lifetime by someone who heard it.
Indeed.
I just wanted to add one thought to your question, Chitra, because I think the more and more we have a chance to engage in these unconventional conversations, the more delighted we are, and so we're no longer these feelings. As we noticed, the poll was moving from anxious and scared to joyful, hopeful, and I always keep in mind, because it would be my greatest desire actually to have more and more conversations with people who don't think exactly as I do, but who are at least willing to become friends, right? And that could be my friends, neighbors, coworkers. And I always keep in mind is sometimes some pretty amazing and maybe even to some outrageous statements are made in the conversations that I'm in. And I call to mind this statement that Abdul Baha, the son of the founder of the Bahá'i Faith, Baha'u'llah, he was speaking to people in London at one point, and they asked him what to do about the problem of the poor, and even the notion of calling people the poor as though it's a different group of people. But he said to them something that to me is the essence of oneness. He said, do not be satisfied until each one is to you as a member of your own family. Regard each one either as a father or as a brother or as a sister or as a mother or as a child. If you can attain to this, your difficulties will vanish. You will know what to do. This is the teaching of Baha'u'llah. And so, I don't know, sometimes that maybe seems a little oversimplified, but to me, it overcomes a great deal of complexity. And when someone confronts me, I happen to live in the state of Georgia, and there's a wide range of viewpoints among my friends and my neighbors and my coworkers. And I figure that when someone comes to me with something that it doesn't appear to be unifying, that's still my brother or my sister or my mother or my child. Mm-hmm. And so then the difficulty of me trying to fight that person, I would never, I'm not going to try to fight my own mother. I'm not going to, so the posture, I think, of humility comes into play. And I don't have to try to force you to be something else. I already love you. And if this is who you are, if you never change views, so be it. But often these hearts unite, and then the ability to even hear something that, I never thought about, all of the people of the world being one. I was taught, as I used to live across the street from a 90-some-year-old Ku Klux Klan member who identified himself as such. We became very good friends, and it was interesting to hear him. But he described his upbringing, and it was very different from my upbringing. So what he was taught was different. But I remember one day he came to my house in a great deal of excitement, and he said, I learned that I was taught that the coloreds was dirty, but the coloreds is cleaner than the white folks. So now this may not seem to you all as a very enlightened statement, but you think of a man who was born so long ago and was taught some things that didn't unify mankind, and he had come to a new understanding. So that's something that always occurs for me when we have these conversations.
Love, unity.
Lev, you had something to add too.
All of these stories are very moving, and I wanted to say thank you to everyone for sharing them. I was thinking about Chitra's question. I grew up in a very segregated city. I grew up outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Milwaukee is one of the most segregated cities in the United States. And even the town I live in today, although there is greater racial diversity, it's still fairly segregated, and I live in a predominantly white town, and our Baha'i community reflects that. It's predominantly white and predominantly Persian. But to this question of how do we meet people maybe who are not exactly like-minded or just from different walks of life and different perspectives, it can be hard when the structures of your own community perhaps work against that. And so my wife and I have been trying to think about where are there social spaces that we could enter that might afford new kinds of friendships and new kinds of relationships. And we've actually found the school district to be a productive channel for that. So the school district helped to start something called a community alliance after a number of racial hate speech incidences that happened a decade or so ago. And they're also hosting a workshop on addressing anti-Black racism in the school system. And so participating in those spaces, originally in person, but since the pandemic, virtually, has been a chance to meet parents and educators and administrators who are thinking about these questions, often from very different perspectives, and begin to make new kinds of friendships. And I am still, I think, at a loss for how to introduce some of the ideas that we've been learning about here into those conversations, but at least I'm beginning to have new spaces and new friendships in which I can think about how to have these conversations.
I wanted to say that I also prefer certain spaces and environments. And since we all know we're world citizens, right? But how do you put that visual in your own mind? Because I think I'm colorblind too, but I'm not. The goal is to be colorblind in your heart, as we all recognize color in so many levels. And one of the things that I think made me, I have also the same question: how do I break out of my bubble, my indigenous bubble? When I learned going to racism workshops is really an important way, because you learn a lot from a lot of different people, and they're in different spaces in the spectrum. And one of the things that 99.8% taught me was that, oh my word, you're a relative of mine. I mean, I could say it, but to, really believe it, it was like, no, I don't, we're not related. No, I mean, but we are. And I had to confront that in my head. You mean you're not Tlingit and we're related? I'm going like, it was really difficult for me to leave that, to put my Tlingit heritage in the back burner, because that was me. That was my identity. That's my family. That's, everything I know, my values. Although they don't conflict with the Baha'i Faith, there was a real conflict in my head and heart to really accept the fact that you're related to me. And I had to, when you get there, you have to break down your boundaries and your mental barriers. Because if I really truly believe you're my sister or my cousin or, my uncle, then there's a level of trust that comes with that. And I have to start verbalizing it too. I have to start breaking out of my little inner circle and start saying, hi, sister. Hi, uncle. Because it makes it a reality.
I love that idea. I really do. I appreciate, I happen to come from a community where everyone is auntie and uncle and mama and baba. And so it makes it seem more real, doesn't it? These are the members of my family, even though they are my neighbors and so forth. I was just thinking.
We go to lengths with DNA and everything to find lost family members. Why don't we do that just in our neighborhood, in our own communities? Why don't we just go to great lengths? With determination and not any agenda, maybe with a lot of fear and trepidation, but it's because we want to find them and know them and love them and have them in our lives, right? In the grocery store, everywhere you go.
Mm-hmm. Even during the pandemic, we can have little papers with a Zoom link that we go and pass around our neighbors and start becoming friends on Zoom that way. Mm-hmm. There's so many ways to just start from our very own neighborhoods to create these meaningful relationships. Yeah.
I'm so delighted because, of course, under all conditions, right? These are our family members, and maybe we become more aware of that, even in this time where we don't have as many opportunities, perhaps, to be, together in that way. But I thought it would be good just to bring back to us the kind of behind the scenes, if you will, on these unconventional conversations. As we discussed, they focus on oneness and there's no otherness. So as much as Lori was talking about, we want to make sure that our hearts are like mirrors and that they see the soul of others. And at the same time, what I think is beautiful about the Baha'i Faith, when I first learned about it, is this notion of we are flowers of one garden. And therefore, I'm not attempting to see you as a rose if in fact you are a daisy. What I'm attempting to do is understand the equality of roses and daisies, and not to say, my goodness, the rose is the superior flower and the daisy is just, we tolerate the daisy. I believe, anyway, in my heart, that this is what I'm striving towards as far as this idea of who do I see.
That's even if the rose has too much aroma, we can still appreciate it.
All of these beautiful flowers, and yes, each of them showing up with their own characteristics. I mean, even the flower of the prickly pear, that's a little hard for you to even get to, right? It stabs your fingers a little bit, but nevertheless, still a flower. So trying to learn about this idea of oneness. The other element that kept these unconventional is that we did focus always on this framework for action. We always studied together. We mentioned the guidance. We always consulted. We had some small breakout groups that we would work in, but in reflection, actually, Judith and I discovered that most of the actual work was done in large groups. So we actually shortened the time that was in the smaller breakouts and lengthened the time for whole group, because we could just see that's where more of the work was taking place. After our consultation, we would have every week some action, and then we'd come back and we'd reflect on it. And one other element that's worth saying is time, right? The Baha'i Faith is beautiful. We don't even prolong things that are good. And one of the things that often weights down a conversation on race or anything else is it goes on too long. And then people begin to get tired and tempers flare and different. So we really did keep these intentionally to 90 minutes or less, because we thought, well, that's, this is the amount. We know that we're not going to resolve racism in a conversation, but can we advance a little bit and then come back and reflect on our action? So those were just some of the the elements that we really were looking at. And we wanted to make sure that the conversations that came out of this were reinforcing the idea that we're all one, that we are equal, and that we are all learning. There was no expertise that said, gee, I know all about how to overcome racism, and now I'm going to school you, but rather we need to learn together. We also wanted to find out what elements of the conversation encourage all parties to contribute, each according to his or her current understanding and capacity. That allows us to have conversations with all of the people, including my 90-some-year-old Ku Klux Klan member neighbor. He's also part of the body of humanity and in this conversation as well. We wanted to find out what elements of the conversation encourage cooperative action and mutual support. And so groups of people sometimes would talk together about what they were going to do together. And then we also wanted to find out what elements of the conversation acknowledge that human beings are capable of advancing our understanding. So where I am today is not where I will be always. And given a proper education and opportunities to practice and be with friends, I can certainly advance. So those were some of the key points for us. I don't know if there are other things we wanted to bring up in this session before we close out, but certainly appreciate everything you've shared.
There's something else I wanted to share. Mm-hmm. It ties into the latest letter we got on the 25th from the House of Justice.
The Day of the Covenant, yes.
Yes. It's the next to last paragraph in the letter near the bottom. But it's in line, because we may live in a neighborhood where people may or may not be on board with the oneness of mankind. But like you said, but it talks about be well-wishers with everybody is one thing it points out through our words and deeds, and our resolute commitment to discover that precious point of unity where contrasted perspectives overlap, around which contending peoples can coalesce. So if we're going around really listening, what is their concern? What is meaningful to them, to each person, each soul, wherever they are? So,
and to piggyback on you, Dennis, before we close too, I think one of the things that stood out for me in terms of as we went through this, particularly the one on your list and our list of people taking people where they are. And I think this kind of speaks to your question, teacher, of how do we start people in these conversations? Is one, recognizing we're not going to talk to everybody and get right. Not going open-handed, but also getting to the space where you're comfortable and expecting people to be uncomfortable, right? I mean, I think one one of the things that stands out in my mind from one of our sessions, a woman had said she didn't feel she knew enough about African American history. And so she was doing a lot of studying about that and didn't feel she could speak to changing things until she learned more. I mean, we kind of had several people, and I know I did too, respond like, look, that's a wonderful and admirable goal, but where you are right now is where you are. So be open and don't be afraid to say, I mean, particularly if we're working with the consultation concepts, don't be afraid to show your ignorance. Don't be afraid to be vulnerable. Don't be afraid to put your hand out and say, I'm learning too. And that we don't have to get to a place where we're presenting ourselves as an ideal image before we can try to connect with somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes, Lev, go ahead.
In the previous slide, the framework for action, and I just wanted to call out the idea of reflection. I was one of those who, in the first meeting in the poll, probably put anxious or nervous about these conversations. And today, when we had the small poll here, I very easily was able to check hopeful. And I think part of that actually has to do with reflection and just holding the space for these conversations week after week. As we were taking action in our communities, just with that example of the devotional gathering that I shared, through reflection, we actually started to talk, not in the space of the conversation, but it allowed for it. We reflected on certain patterns. We started to notice, for example, that some of our white passing children felt that as long as they were not mean to Black children, that meant that somehow they were not affected by racism. And as we saw things like this, that's not something you can address in one conversation with a child, but we saw these questions come up. And so a theme of the devotional gathering has become over time questions about how all of us are affected by racism and what we can do. And I think without the space of these unconventional conversations really focused on action, study, and reflection, I would not have found a greater sense of hopefulness in the conversation. So thank you.
No, and thank you for sharing that, Lev, because that was one of the things that we had talked about and had wanted in terms of like how many of these do we do, and does it go on forever and ever, and does it become like a devotional? It was just like, no, this is just to get everyone started to go off and do exactly what you're doing in terms of how am I incorporating and thinking differently in my own life and in my own area. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it's very helpful because again, yes, there are many spaces that are more conventional perhaps, and they do go on forever. But we also wanted to emphasize the idea that although we are always thinking globally, the earth is but one country and mankind its citizens, all action is actually local. So if I spend all of my days on international Zooms and national and so forth, I actually don't have time to do work in my own neighborhood, and therefore I can't practice. So we loved that all of you went out and your many friends who joined us during those 4 weeks and always made effort in your own community and then came back and we could reflect on that action. So thank you all so much. We learned a lot and hope that you did as well.
Yes, thank you.
And thank you all so much for your participation in today's program. I know many people will benefit from hearing the work that you're doing and hopefully be inspired to do more in their neighborhood. So on behalf of the Wilmette Institute, thank you so much, everyone.